All right. Well, last week we looked at Romans 12, 3 through 8, and how we're to be unified, one unified body, and how we're to use our gifts to serve one another. And this week we're going to continue through Romans 12. And the thing is, Paul's writing style changes really abruptly here. So Paul is normally very elaborate and methodical, kind of making sure to take his time explaining a passage so you really understand what's going on there. But here he's going to move to a series of brief statements on the attitude of the Christian as they serve. He doesn't offer a lot of explanation. He just kind of begins rattling them off one after another, almost machine gun style here. There's linking thoughts, but they're kind of separated by kind of things that are kind of almost seem like they're shoved in the middle there, and they don't seem to really fit there, but they go with something later on. Well, this is a specific ancient writing style called paranesis. It's usually used for moral instruction, and the writer is going to refer back to things that the audience would have understood, that would have been common knowledge for them. And then it's also a method that's very rapid fire, it's very loose, and it's very just moving point to point very quickly. This is, like I said, not common with Paul. He does use it in 1 Thessalonians 5 and Philippians 4, but usually he's kind of really good at taking his time to explain things. And so it's kind of a really abrupt change here. It's kind of like if you've ever been in the passenger in a car and not really paying attention, and all of a sudden the driver goes, brake check, and everyone's, whoa, and then all of a sudden you're really paying attention, right? It's that kind of thing. It's jarring. So it calls our attention and say, okay, Paul, what's going on here? So as we look through the passage today, like I said, he's kind of have a thought here, and there's going to be something in between, and then another thought here. So we're going to kind of match up the linking thoughts and kind of follow it that way, and then come back to the thoughts that are in between and see where they kind of match up. So we're going to jump around a little bit within the passage, but the words will be on the screen so you can follow along. What does make it nice is even though it's kind of jumpy, the opening passage and the end passage bookend it really nicely, and everything falls within the context of those two verses. So if we look at verse 9, we're going to look at verses 9 through 21 today. So look at verse 9. It says, "Let love be genuine, abhor what is evil, and hold fast to what is good." And then verse 21 says, "Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." All the thoughts that are going to be communicated in this passage are going to fit within that context. They're all going to have this overarching goal of leading us towards having genuine love that hates what is evil, that clings to what is good, and that drives us towards actually being able to overcome evil with good. So verse 9 here starts, and it says that love must be genuine, sincere. Right? Okay, well, that sounds simple enough. I love my family, I love my friends, I love my church, I love my community. That all seems sincere. I'm not faking it, I don't think. So I think I'm good here, Paul. Let's move on. Let's go to the next thing here, right? But let's take a moment and stop and say, okay, Paul, this seems too simple. What are you talking about here? And the word that he uses here is anipokritos. Okay? It means without hypocrisy. That's the word he uses for genuine. When he says genuine, he's saying it's without any hypocrisy. And if you read the verse in the NASB, it actually uses that literal translation. It says, "Let love be without hypocrisy." So we're supposed to love in such a way that there's no room for hypocrisy in our affection for one another. Well, to understand that, of course, we have to understand what does it mean to be a hypocrite. So we think of this in the modern realm, we think of it kind of as being two-faced or saying one thing and doing another. What immediately jumps to mind for me is the world of politics, right? So you have a candidate, and they make all kinds of campaign promises, but then when they're in office, they usually do whatever they want to do, right? So that's what comes to mind in the modern realm, but let's look at kind of what the context of the origin of that means. So if any of you had drama in college maybe, or in high school, or even middle school, you might have learned this. The word hypocrite has its origins in Greek dramas. The actors would actually have various masks that they would put up in front of their face as they portrayed the different roles. So the same actor would have this mask to represent this character, or this mask representing this character, and suddenly they could shift roles just as easily. They could actually go from being the villain to being the hero just by which mask they put in front of them. That's where we get this idea of being two-faced, having multiple faces. They literally did. And it was their role to try and trick you into believing that they were actually the character they were portraying. Right? That's what good actors do. In fact, let's take a moment here and look at what some actors say about their craft. Laurence Olivier says, "What is acting but lying? And what's good lying but convincing lying?" Now, Mel Gibson, regardless what you may think of him personally, he's been in some pretty blockbuster, amazing roles, right? And he has this to say. He says, "Acting is like lying, the art of lying well. I get paid to tell elaborate lies." Now let's bring the demographic down in age a little bit here and look at someone. Let's look at Leonardo DiCaprio. He says, "Don't even think for a moment that I'm really like any of the characters I've played. I'm not. That's why it's called acting." And of course, if you know me, and we're talking about movies here, I gotta relate it back to a superhero movie, right? So Robert Downey Jr., who plays Iron Man in all of the Marvel movies, has this to say. He says, "I know very little about acting. I'm just really good. I'm just an incredibly good faker." Right? This is not a knock against actors. They're just doing what they're paid to do. We love their ability that they have to transport us to another place, to another time, to another setting, to see something from someone else's perspective. Like, if you're like me, you love movies, right? We love them for the scripts and the stories that they tell. Maybe you love a particular movie because of its amazing cinematography and how beautiful everything is and the scenery. Or maybe the director makes all the right decisions and really brings the story to life on the screen, right? But when everything's said and done, it's really the actors that we go to see, right? They're the ones that draw in the crowds. They're the ones whose faces are on the posters and billboards. They're the ones who get the big billing and the credits. They're the ones who bring home the big check. Now, why is this? Because largely, they're the ones that make it or break it for the movie. They're the ones that can get us to suspend our reality and buy into this imaginary world that's been created. Their job is to try and trick us, right? Now, that's okay in the world of entertainment. That's great. That's what we're going to do. We're spending money to have a time away from reality for a little bit. It's great. But there's no room for that in our relationships with one another. Paul says, "Let love be genuine, without hypocrisy." Essentially, what he's saying here is really love people. Don't just let it be an act. These rest of the statements that we're going to follow up with here spell this out. So continuing, verse 9 says, "Abhor what is evil, hold fast to what is good." Or some translations say, "Cling to what is good." Paul's possibly borrowing this from what they would have known from Amos 5:15. It says 4 words at the beginning that sum this up. Hate evil and love good. And just in case we thought love was butterflies in our stomach and a warm feeling that we have towards people, Paul is going to show us it's much more than that. Genuine love, get this, actually leads us towards a hatred of evil. It drives us to attach ourselves to that which is good. As Christians, we are to champion good. This idea of clinging towards what is good is kind of like we have this phrase that we use that they were glued to, right? They were glued to their phone. They were glued to their TV. It means, hey, I'm trying to talk to you, but you're so distracted by your phone, you're not paying attention. You're so distracted by what you're watching or the social media that you're on or the internet that you're on, whatever you're doing, that you're so distracted that I can't get a word through. You're not paying attention to anything but that. It's your sole focus. Same kind of idea of being glued to. It's that type of cling. We're to cling to good like that. And we talk a lot about love as Christians. We have it on bumper stickers, posters. Maybe you have verses about love even on little sticky notes throughout your house to remind you. But I think often we actually don't take the time to examine and really look at what genuine love actually is. And so we have all these sayings that make us feel good, but we're not examining what they're really talking about. We often think of love and hate as contrary, so it's jarring to hear Paul talk about hating evil as being a part of love. But love that is real love is going to, by definition, hate that which is unloving. Now, if we're looking for expressions of love in the scriptures, a great place to look, of course, is the Psalms. We see the psalmists, they pour their heart out to God. You get a raw and unfiltered view of just them crying out to God. So love is expressed tremendously there. We see in Psalm 97, it calls those that love the Lord to hate evil. And again, Psalm 119 reminds us of this idea. It says, I hate and despise falsehood, but I love your law. Psalms 4:7, and then the same idea is repeated in Hebrews 1:19, shows us it's commendable to love righteousness, but what? Hate lawlessness. Love is only shown to be true and non-hypocritical when it drives us towards the things of God and away from the things of evil. Now, verse 11 in Romans here is going to develop this thought that's introduced in verse 9. It says, do not be slothful in zeal, be fervent in the Spirit, serve the Lord. Paul says you can't be slothful in service. There is no room for lazy Christianity, he says. It requires action. And we talked last week about this word zeal. We said it means diligence. We defined that. We said diligence means that you have a passion, you have a vision, but not just that you carry it out, that you see it through, that you make sure it gets done. That's what he's talking about. He's coming back to the same idea here. He's saying in your service to the Lord, be diligent. This requires action. James 1:22, but be doers of the word and not hearers only, and so deceive yourself. If we hear the word and we're like, yeah, that's great, we don't do anything about it, we're lying to ourselves. To see, service requires action. It's built into it. But action itself is not enough. He says to be passionate about it. He says to be fervent in the Spirit, serving the Lord. In the Greek, the idea of fervent here is that of a fiery passion. Okay? It's the word that they use to describe a rolling boil. Now, if you're like me, hopefully you're better, but my culinary skills are very lacking, okay? So I'm like, what is a rolling boil? I decided to do some studying on this week, and I looked it up. I said, what's the difference between a rolling boil and a simmering? Because you always see that in directions and in instructions and recipes. Like, what's the difference there? I don't even know. So I'm looking it up, and I find out that in order for water to boil, it has to reach 212 degrees Fahrenheit. So typically, we're boiling water, we put water in a pan, it's on the heat source, the bottom of the pan heats up first, and that which is closest to the heat starts to boil a little bit. You get those little bubbles, it starts boiling, it starts simmering to the top. That's a simmer. The part that's close to the source is boiling. It's reached to 212 degrees. The rest of the water, though, has lost that energy through the water, through the sides of the pan, even the air at the top, and through evaporation. That heat is lost. The rest of the pan is not 212 degrees. If you're under a water boil order, they're saying, hey, your water's not safe. Make sure you boil it before you drink it, or you could get sick. Merely simmered water is not going to cut it. You're going to get sick. We need water that's come to a rolling boil. So what is that? It's water that has reached 212 degrees throughout the entire contents of the pan. It's unified. Throughout the entire part of it has this type of passion. It's going through the entire core of it. Everything that is about has reached that. That's the type of passion he's talking about. He's talking about passion that goes through every part of our being, not just part of it over here. You can't compartmentalize your Christianity. If we're to have genuine, non-hypocritical love, it needs to drive every aspect of what we are. It should move us towards service in our homes, in our churches, in our schools, in our workplaces, and as we'll see in a minute, in service towards our brothers and sisters, like we talked about last week, but also in service of even our enemies. This is the type of love we're instructed to have. A love for that which is right, but also love that hates what is evil. Now, that word hate is jarring. We don't like it, right? In fact, if we talk about our culture for a moment, they say, whoa, that's not okay. You're not allowed to hate. You can't hate even what's wrong. This is judgmental. You're being judgmental. You're being bigoted. If you hate sin, you hate that person. Paul says it's not true. Look in verse 10. He says, love one another with brotherly affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. We're to love each other certainly like a family. Paul's addressing believers here. And if we remember last week, we said the first 11 chapters of Romans was dealt with the theology of the gospel, while the last 5 chapters he's saying, okay, now that we've grasped all those concepts, here's how you live it out. Well, Paul's already talked about this brotherly affection and that we're brothers and sisters in chapter 8, verse 8, 16 through 17. The Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, provided we suffer with him in order that we may also be glorified with him. So this is addressing the believer, saying, hey, since we're a spiritual family, let's actually love each other like a family. But the second part of verse 10 goes beyond that, right? Outdo each other in showing affection, or in showing honor, sorry. This certainly can apply to those outside the body as well. After all, Jesus modeled this in his ministry. So as studying this, the 2 things that came immediately to mind are 2 examples of people that you wouldn't even expect in that day for a rabbi to associate with. Right? The woman that was caught in the middle of adultery, she was literally caught in the middle of her sin. And then even the woman at the well, series of relationships, series of marriages, and now she's living with someone she's not married to. But Jesus showed them honor by seeing the person behind the sin. He saw someone was lost and hurting and needing a relationship with him. He took time out to speak with them. This is a thought that Paul's going to continue to develop in 16 through 18. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. By all rights, Jesus shouldn't even been there. He shouldn't have been having that conversation. But he was compassionate. Never be wise in your own sight. Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of who? In the sight of all. Not just people that are like us, not just people that are like-minded, not just our brothers and sisters, everyone. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. See, we're to live in harmony with everybody. We're not considering their status. We're not to be thinking, oh, that sin's too great. I can't associate with that person over there. So we're to be doing what's honorable in the sight of all people. Now, this doesn't negate his command to hate what is evil. We can't compromise our message, but we have to be compassionate in how we communicate it to the audience. Paul understands there's going to be times where there is no acceptable outcome to our opponent than for us to deviate from God's law. And he says that's unacceptable. Don't do that. This is where the if possible comes into play. He says, if you can live peaceably without compromising your faith, then do so, but not at the cost of being ungodly. Now, sadly, we've seen many believers, we've seen entire denominations fail to grasp the hatred of evil is actually a tenet of love. They've caved into some of these messages. They're no longer willing to call sin wrong, but now accept it, maybe even champion it under a perversion of their new definition of love. See, they're more concerned with the way the declaration of truth might be received by the hearer than by the need for the truth to be declared. We can't allow this to happen in our lives. We're responsible to make sure that we have done everything that we can do to show honor without compromising the message. The question becomes, how did I deliver it? Was I haughty? Was I judgmental? Was I being accusatory? Was I more concerned with their actions and how icky those things made me feel than with the fact that they need salvation? If this is the case, then we are not preaching the gospel of Jesus. We are preaching a gospel of moralism, and that's wrong. We have to be able to see the person separate from their sin, no matter how egregious or socially unacceptable the sin happens to be. We're to love themselves with non-hypocritical love. We're not to be two-faced. We have to ask ourselves, do I see a person needing Jesus, or is that just another drug addict over there? Do I see someone who's lost and scared and confused and needing a Savior? Is that just another one of those homosexuals? Do we see a soul that could be one conversation or maybe one loving act away from embracing Jesus? Or do we see a person who's finally getting what they deserve? Are we not so different than them? Were we not all lost in our trespasses and sins at some point? The difference between lost and found is acceptance of the free gift of the gospel and following the one who offers it. But sometimes we forget that before Jesus was in our life, that we were in the same boat. Now, our sins, they may have been more acceptable. They may have been what we would say smaller. They may not be as egregious as we would think, but the end result is ultimately the same, right? And sometimes as forgiven Christians, it's easier for us to focus on honestly, to hate what's evil. I got that part down. But we fail in the compassion area, forgetting we once ourselves were in that very category. So let's pause there and let's look at another thought that Paul's having here and backtrack to verses 12 and 13, and then we'll also look at 15. He says to rejoice in hope, be patient in tribulation, be constant in prayer, contribute to the needs of the saints, and seek to show hospitality. Rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. Now, Paul tells us here there's going to be hardship. After all, when do we need hope the most? When it seems hopeless. When do we need someone to weep with us, to go through hardship with us when we're heartbroken? Jesus promises in Matthew 16:33, and Paul's reminding us here, in this world you will have tribulation. He says he's overcome the world. This is a given, it's a promise, it's a fact. Why does Paul tell us here to contribute to the needs of the saints? Because it's a given that there's going to be needs. Now, in the first century, the Christians were largely migratory, especially the apostles and the missionaries, right? They would travel from town to town, to city to these churches. They would love them. They would serve them. They would bring the word of God with them. Paul's saying, hey, when they come, be hospitable to them. Give them a place to stay. Give them food. Give them shelter. Give them clothes. Treat them nice, serve them, and in so serving them, you are proclaiming the gospel along with them. You get to take part in that. Reminds me of what we talked about last week. But it also reminds me of the opposite of that, where Jesus tells us in Matthew 10:14. Jesus is about to send out the disciples to minister, and he tells them before they go out, hey, now if anyone doesn't receive you or they don't listen to your words, then shake the dust off from your feet when you leave that house or town. And Jesus says, it's going to be worse for them in the day of judgment than it was for Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, I don't know about you, but that's not the camp I want to be in. I want to be engaging, I want to be encouraging, I want to be equipping the people that are coming up alongside me so that the gospel is proclaimed. And I get to celebrate in their victories, and I get to be a part of them leading other people to Christ. This is how the work of the local church is carried out. Now, our mission and vision here at FBC Fulton is pointing people to Jesus. We do this through encountering God in our worship together, through word and prayer, through equipping each other, through service and ministry, through groups and through relationships, and through engaging the world with the gospel of Jesus Christ through outreach and through missions. If you don't know that, that's our vision and mission statement right there. That is what we have said we come together to be about. That is who we are and what we're about. And if you notice something about that, it's all things that we do together. Working together is meeting each other's needs. By meeting your need, I'm equipping you to then be able to use your gift, like we talked about last week. And then I get to take part in that. That's how the vision of the church is accomplished. So moving from an inward focus to an outward focus, Paul in 14 and 20 is going to be concerned with how we treat our enemies. Verse 14, bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. And then verse 20, to the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. In so doing, you'll heap burning coals on his head. Now, Paul is fleshing out ideas again here that he's already spelled out in Romans 5. But he's dealing with us there. Starting in verse 8, but God shows his love for us in this, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Since therefore we've now been justified by his blood, much more shall we be saved by him from the wrath of God. For while we were enemies with God, we were reconciled by the death of his Son. Much more, now that we're reconciled, shall we be saved by his life. Christ did the unthinkable for us. We were his enemy. We were diametrically opposed to everything that God is about. We might as well have been in Jerusalem in that crowd shouting, crucify him, give us Barabbas. But Jesus had this genuine love for us, this non-hypocritical love. There was nothing two-faced about it. We deserved wrath, it says here, but he gave us grace, and it was grace at a great cost. How wrong is it then for us not to extend that grace to others? Now, when we're recipients of grace, that's great, right? I'd say, okay, I love that. But when we're asked to give it towards others, or even if we see it given towards others, sometimes it rubs us the wrong way. We're like, wait, that's not right. They did something wrong. There should be a consequence for that. Someone needs to judge them. There needs to be something going on there. Because we have this sense of justice that we feel needs to be, confirmed. It leaves us feeling cheated when those things happen. And we talked about movies earlier, and I love movies. We watch tons of movies at our house. My wife and I are very different type of movies we like. One thing that ruins movies for her quicker than anything is when the bad guy gets away with it at the end. Right? It leaves you feeling cheated. It's not the way it's supposed to end. We want life, like our movies, to be in a nicely wrapped, neat little package that lets us feel good. The bad guy does something bad, the good guy saves the day, and then the bad guy is rightly punished for what he does. We leave the theater with a large soda, buttery fingers, and warm feelings, right? Now, I don't know about you, have you ever been to a melodrama? In middle school and high school, we would take field trips to this melodrama about an hour outside of town in Madrid, New Mexico. It was a ghost town, and it was actually a train station that was converted into a theater. And they would do this spaghetti western type play. All the characters were very overly stereotyped. The good guy was very much like Dudley Do-Right. So any kids in the audience, ask your parents who in the world is Dudley Do-Right. But the heroine, of course, she gets tied to the train tracks just to get saved just in the nick of time. And then the bad guy looks just like Snively Whiplash. He has the black top hat, the cane, the cape, even the curled mustache, right? And the little chuckle and the sneer. Anyways, at melodramas, you're encouraged, the audience is encouraged to interact with the play. You cheer, hurrah, for the good guy when he comes on the stage. And you boo the bad guy when he shows up. Even going so far as they tell you, throw your popcorn and your peanuts at him as he's trying to deliver his lines. It's great fun, right? You're the bad guy, we don't like you. You're standing up and yelling at him. He's trying to do his job, and you're hitting him with peanuts at the same time. Of course, this type of play is always going to resolve with the good guy saving the day, everyone cheers, and everyone goes home happy. But if we're careful, we want that in real life too. You see, sometimes we want those who are against us, or if we're really honest, maybe not even against us, but maybe they're just not like us, or maybe we just don't like them a whole lot, to have hardship occur to them. That's not right. It could be internally felt, or it could be expressed as we make a comment to a friend. Maybe we go so far as to even make a post on social media say, hey, they finally got what they deserved. So there's something cathartic when we see the bad guys in our lives get what we feel is just. But Paul echoes what Jesus says in Luke's account of the Sermon on the Mount in 6:27 through 29. But I say to those of you who hear, love your enemies. Okay? Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. To the one who strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from him who takes away your cloak, do not withhold your tunic either. Jesus says it's not enough just not to get revenge. He says we're to actively seek their good. We're to pray for their well-being. We're to bless them. That doesn't gel with us. That's contrary to everything we've learned growing up. Make sure you play fair. Right? There's something in us that says, I don't like that. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense until we pair it with verse 19. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it's written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. And then going back to 20, to the contrary, if your enemy's hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink, for by doing so, you'll heap burning coals on his head. We're instructed to feed him. We're instructed to give him something to drink when he's thirsty. See what's happening here? We're instructed to serve our brothers and sisters, but we're also instructed to serve our enemies the same way. And Jesus modeled this, right? So we're going to read later on today, I'm sure, on the night he was to be betrayed. right? We're going to talk about the Last Supper. Well, what happened that evening? What do we see Jesus doing? He washed the disciples' feet, even Judas. He shared, as we will, the most intimate meal probably of his life. Even with Judas, to the very end, he's showing him love. On the same night that Judas is going to leave that place and go and get the chief priests and bring them to the Mount of Olives to have him arrested and crucified, the last thing we see Jesus interacting with them is showing love to the one whose very name is synonymous with betrayal now. It's unsettling for us to see, to be called to serve our enemies because we have this sense of justice, of our own sense of justice that we feel needs carried out. We even have a term for this in extreme circumstances these days. It's a new term that's been developed called social justice warriors, right? And we probably largely don't agree with a lot of what they call injustice or justice, but if we're honest, we have at least a remnant of that echoing in our own lives when we see the people that we feel have wronged us, no matter how large or small. If we're really honest, a lot of times we want harm to come to them, not blessing. We want justice. But see, what we have to offer isn't justice. God reminds us here, he does say, vengeance is mine and I will repay. Justice is coming. That has to be enough for us. And there's a good reason for it. Here's the most amazing part here. Okay, you ready? Why can't we act out justice? Why can't we seek revenge? Why can't we be full of vengeance and wrath? They did something wrong, after all, they deserve it. How do you seek vengeance against someone and then turn around and lead them to the Lord? Your credibility's gone. They have no reason to listen to anything you say. I've sought out my wrath and I'm satisfied. That's all that matters. But if we wait, if we're patient, we allow God to judge them, there's this hope that they may come to know the Lord. And that maybe even, here's the great thing, maybe our graciousness and our patience with them will even play into them coming to know Jesus. By holding off wrath, we can actually lead people to Christ. This echoes strongly of verse 14, instruction to bless them. After all, what blessing could be greater than playing a role in someone coming to know Jesus? Now, verse 20 here talks about heaping burning coals on their heads. There's tons of schools of thought on what that means, and we're not going to go into all of those possibilities, but it's generally agreed that the best possible outcome of that is by somehow they come to know and have saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. Either this could be through our modeling correct behavior or our being forgiving and loving them or whatever it may be. But the ultimate outcome, the goal there in not showing vengeance is this. They were our enemies. They were against us. They could possibly move to be our brothers and sisters. They used to be opposed to us. Maybe now we can serve together to lead others to Christ. And this fits perfectly with the ending in verse 21. As we see, it says, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Godly love resists evil. It hates it passionately. It strives for goodness so much that it clings to it. It serves not only those that it sees as family, but even those that are its enemies. Those that the world says, by every right, you should hate them. It calls us to love them. It's a lot of work. Paul says there's no room for the lazy here. If we're not fervent in the Spirit, if we don't have that rolling boil of passion that goes through every ounce of our being, when we serve, evil can easily overcome us. We can become haughty that he warns us against. When we strive for the godly things, when we uncompromisingly cling to our message, but convey it in a compassionate, loving way, then evil can be overcome with good, with the love of God. So let us love one another. Let us love our enemies. Let us love our Lord with this kind of genuine love.